It was July 1976. The Washington, D.C. heat clung to the air like a damp curtain as Elton John stepped backstage after one of the strangest nights of his life. He had just met Elvis Presley. But the man he found sitting in that dimly lit room wasn't the radiant hero who once ruled the world. Elvis was bloated, his skin pale, his eyes heavy with exhaustion. A haze of medication surrounded him. Yet, when he spoke, when he smiled, the old spark flickered, like embers of a dying fire refusing to fade. Elton, himself a global star by then, stood frozen. This was his idol, the man whose voice had carried across oceans, whose hips had scandalized television screens, whose very existence had shown a post-war generation that rebellion could be beautiful. But now, the king seemed fragile, even mortal. Elton would later admit he walked away shaken because for the first time, he saw what fame could do. Yet here's the truth. Elvis was not just meeting Elton John that night, he was, unknowingly, looking into the eyes of his heirs. David Bowie, across the Atlantic, had already built an entire universe of sound and spectacle inspired by the king's daring. Bowie, the chameleon, had been just a boy in grey post-war Britain when Elvis's voice electrified him. And Elton, then still Reginald Dwight, had pounded the piano, dreaming of escape, with Elvis records guiding his hands. Elvis was more than a star. He was a blueprint, a warning, a dream. The question was never whether Bowie or Elton would copy Elvis. The question was, what would they carry from his rise and from his fall? What lessons would they learn as they carved their own paths into legend? And more hauntingly, would those lessons save them, or would they too risk being devoured by the very crown they inherited? The answer lies in the sound that shook post-war Britain. Britain in the 1950s was a land draped in grey. The war was over, but the rubble still whispered of loss. Streets were narrow, food was rationed, and for young boys and girls the future seemed already written. Work hard, keep quiet, fit in. And then came that sound. A voice crackling through radios with a growl that was both dangerous and seductive. A guitar riff that felt like it had been stolen from the devil himself. Songs like Heartbreak Hotel, Hound Dog, and Jailhouse Rock burst through the Atlantic static, like lightning splitting the British sky. It was Elvis Presley. And for millions of restless youth, he was not just a singer, he was the permission slip they had been waiting for. The proof that life could be larger, louder, and unapologetically alive. David Robert Jones, who would later rename himself David Bowie, was just 9 years old when he first heard Hound Dog. His schoolmates would later recall how he would mimic Elvis's sneer, his stance, even his lip curl. Bowie wasn't merely entertained, he was possessed. For the boy who would one day paint his face with stardust and step onto stages as an alien rock god, Elvis was the spark. And then, a few miles away in the suburb of Pinner, a shy boy named Reginald Dwight sat at his family piano. The home was ordinary, the life predictable, but Reg had a secret. He'd discovered Elvis. He would spend hours striking keys, trying to capture the rhythm and swagger of the king. Each note wasn't just practice, it was escape. It was the dream that maybe, just maybe, he too could reinvent himself into someone unforgettable. But Elvis didn't just give Bowie and Elton dreams. He gave them something more dangerous. He gave them something more dangerous. He gave them rebellion. Parents were horrified. Politicians condemned him. Church leaders called his gyrating hips the devil's work. The BBC tried to sanitize him, but the more society pushed back, the stronger his grip grew. And for the young Bowie and Elton, that resistance only confirmed what their hearts already knew. Elvis wasn't immoral. Elvis was free. And in post-war Britain, freedom was intoxicating. Still, rebellion has a cost. For every fan who screamed Elvis's name, there was a critic sharpening their knives. Bowie would grow up to understand that cost, how to weaponize controversy and survive it. Elton would learn how to take flamboyance, once considered shameful, and turn it into armor. But at the beginning, it all started with the king's voice. Because when Elvis sang, it didn't matter if you were a boy from Brixton or a quiet pianist in Pinner, you suddenly believed the world could be yours. And yet, the same power that inspired Bowie and Elton was also a curse, because if Elvis could rise like a god, then he could fall like a man. And when the king stumbled, the next generation would be watching closely, ready to take his crown. But could they outshine him, or would they be forever trapped in his shadow? By the early 1960s, Elvis Presley was no longer the rebel who shook the world. Hollywood had swallowed him whole. Film after film, lightweight musicals, predictable plots, turned the king into a caricature of himself. His voice was still golden, but the fire? it was dimming. The man who once scandalized nations was now singing safe, manufactured tunes on movie sets. And while Elvis was trapped in the machinery of fame, two young men across the Atlantic were sharpening their weapons. David Bowie watched carefully. He saw the danger of becoming a product instead of an artist, and so, when his turn came, he refused to be predictable. He didn't just sing songs, he invented worlds. In 1972, he unleashed Ziggy Stardust, a glittering alien rock messiah, an otherworldly figure who blurred the line between man and myth. It was rebellion squared, theatrics on steroids, Elvis's blueprint, but exploded into cosmic proportions. Meanwhile, Reginald Dwight had transformed himself into Elton John. He wore feathered boas, sequined jumpsuits, and star-shaped glasses. He sat behind a piano and turned concerts into carnivals. He made the stage a place where emotions, joy, heartbreak, ecstasy were not hidden but amplified. Every flamboyant gesture was both homage and challenge to Elvis's legacy. But here was the tension. Could anyone truly replace Elvis Presley? For all their genius, Bowie and Elton still moved in his shadow. When Bowie wrote Golden Years in 1975, he imagined Elvis singing it. He even tried to get the King to record it. Elvis declined, but the gesture revealed the truth. Bowie didn't want to kill his idol. He wanted to connect with him, to stand beside him in history. And Elton? He often admitted Elvis was the reason he even dared to step onto a stage. The lessons were clear. Control the crowd, own the moment, bleed emotion into every note. But Elton also saw the traps, the excess, the demands, the temptation to surrender yourself to the machine. It was a paradox. Elvis gave them freedom, but also showed them captivity. He was a beacon and a warning. As the 70s unfolded, Bowie and Elton soared while Elvis declined. They were innovators at their peaks, while the King, padded in rhinestones, was losing his battle with fame and addiction. Yet Bowie and Elton knew better than anyone that the crown was heavy. They weren't merely outshining a fading king, they were learning in real time the cost of carrying his torch. But what happens when idols become men? When the dream collides with reality? Both Bowie and Elton would soon find themselves face to face with the King himself, and that encounter would change everything. Because meeting Elvis wasn't just about meeting a star, it was about confronting their own future. By the mid-1970s, Elvis Presley was no longer untouchable. He was still adored, still worshipped, but the cracks in his crown were impossible to ignore. His health was faltering. His once lean body had grown heavy. The world saw the rhinestones, the white jumpsuits, the grand entrances, but those closest to him saw something else. A man drowning in fame, pills, and pressure. And yet, even then, his aura remained magnetic. David Bowie understood this paradox well. Bowie had long admired Elvis from afar, even offering him songs as a gesture of reverence. One of them was Golden Years. Bowie believed Elvis's voice could carry it to immortality. Elvis, for reasons never fully explained, declined. But that moment revealed Bowie's true feelings. For all his alien personas and avant-garde brilliance, he still saw Elvis as the gravitational force of rock and roll. He didn't just want to surpass him, he wanted to stand in orbit with him. Elton John, however, would come face to face with his idol in a way that left scars. It was 1976 in Maryland. Elton was at the height of his powers, chart-topping albums, sold-out arenas, screaming fans draped in sequins and joy. Yet when he finally met Elvis backstage, he was unprepared for what he saw. Elvis was overweight. His skin was pale, his movements slowed, his speech thickened by medication. And yet, the second he opened his mouth, when that voice filled the room, the magic was still there. Elton was stunned. He later confessed that seeing Elvis in that state shook him to the core. This was the man who had taught him how to hold an audience in the palm of his hand. But now, the lesson was different. Elvis wasn't just a hero anymore, he was a warning. Elton, one friend recalled him saying, "If it can happen to him, it can happen to any of us." And that realization would haunt him. For Bowie, the mid-70s were his most dangerous years. Cocaine, exhaustion, paranoia, they were eating him alive. Yet seeing Elvis's decline, even from a distance, became a mirror. Bowie chose escape. He fled to Berlin, stripping down his sound, detoxing his body, reinventing his art in albums like Low and Heroes. It was survival disguised as reinvention. Elton, too, began to reckon with his own spirals, though his battle would last longer. The image of Elvis backstage stayed with him, a reminder that fame could grant you everything and at the same time take it all away. Because in that moment, Bowie and Elton saw not just Elvis Presley the superstar, they saw the cost of being a king. And the question lingered, terrifying in its simplicity. Would they too end up like him? The answer would come in August of 1977, when the world awoke to the shocking news that the king was gone. And in that silence, Bowie and Elton would have to decide what to do with the crown that had just fallen to the floor. August 16, 1977. The news flashed across radios, televisions, and newspaper headlines: Elvis Presley is dead. The king of rock and roll, gone at just 42 years old. The world gasped in disbelief. Crowds flooded Graceland, fans sobbed in the streets. For millions, it felt as if a piece of their youth had been ripped away. But for David Bowie and Elton John, the shock cut even deeper. This wasn't just the death of an icon, it was a glimpse into what could happen to them if they weren't careful. Bowie was in Berlin at the time, deep in his self-imposed exile from excess. The cocaine paranoia that nearly destroyed him in Los Angeles was still fresh in his memory. When he heard of Elvis's death, it only confirmed his instincts. Survival meant change. Reinvention wasn't just an artistic choice, it was life or death. In the months that followed, Bowie poured himself into music, stripped bare of rock stardom's glitter. Albums like Low and Heroes were cold, haunting, minimalist. They were not Elvis-style showmanship. They were the sound of a man clawing his way back from the abyss. For Bowie, Elvis's death wasn't just tragic. It was a warning siren echoing across his own career. Don't let the crown destroy you. Elton John's response was more conflicted, more painful. He had adored Elvis since childhood. He'd built his stage presence, his flamboyance, his emotional power on the foundation that Elvis laid. Yet when he looked back on that 1976 meeting in Maryland, the memory now burned with even greater intensity. The pale, medicated king he had seen had been a prophecy of what was to come. Elton later admitted that Elvis's death terrified him. The drugs, the exhaustion, the suffocating demands of fame, he saw them in himself. And though it would take years before he truly faced his addictions, the shadow of Elvis's fall lingered in his mind like a ghost. For the world, Elvis's death was a cultural earthquake. Fans left flowers at his gates. The media replayed his greatest performances. Politicians and preachers alike spoke his name. But beneath the mourning, there was a question hanging in the air. If the king could die so young, what did it mean for the artists who followed? For Bowie, it meant doubling down on reinvention, embracing change as a shield against self-destruction. For Elton, it meant wrestling with the darkness of fame until he could finally find sobriety years later. But for both, Elvis's death confirmed a haunting truth. His crown did not disappear. It shattered, and the pieces scattered into the hands of those he had inspired. David Bowie carried the spirit of transformation, showing the world that reinvention was survival. Elton John carried the power of spectacle, commanding arenas with raw emotion and flamboyance. The king had fallen, but his heirs were stepping forward. And yet, the echo of his downfall remained, a constant reminder that the throne of rock and roll was not just glittering, it was deadly. The question that lingered was this: would Elvis's story fade with him, or would it continue, reshaped by those who carried his fire? Elvis Presley's story did not end in 1977. His death was not silence, it was an echo that carried into the voices, the performances, and the lives of those who followed. For David Bowie, Elvis remained the eternal mirror. Bowie once said that Elvis was the ultimate rock star, and though their paths never fully crossed, Bowie lived his career in dialogue with him. Every reinvention, every new skin Bowie wore was born from the lesson Elvis unknowingly gave him: change or be consumed. Bowie turned that lesson into survival, transforming again and again until the very end. For Elton John, the connection was even more personal. He admitted openly that his flamboyant stage persona, his emotional piano ballads, his command of spectacle were all built on the foundation Elvis laid. But he also took from Elvis something darker, something heavier, a warning about addiction, about fame's crushing weight. And though it took Elton years to break free from his own spirals, the image of Elvis haunted him, guiding him toward redemption. Elvis didn't just shape Bowie and Elton. He shaped the very culture of music, fame, and identity. He showed the world that art could be rebellion, that music could be liberation, that one voice could change everything. And he also showed, painfully, that greatness comes with a cost, that the fire that lights a stage can also burn a soul. That is the legacy Bowie and Elton carried forward, not imitation but transformation. Elvis didn't live in their songs as a shadow. He lived as a possibility: what could be created and what could be lost. And today, nearly half a century later, that echo still lingers. Every performer who struts across a stage, every artist who dares to reinvent themselves, every singer who bares their soul before a crowd, they are, knowingly or not, answering to Elvis Presley's call. The king may be gone, but the echo never fades. And so I'll leave you with this question. What lesson do you think today's artists should learn from Elvis's story? Share your thoughts below and keep the conversation alive. Because the crown of rock and roll was never meant to belong to one man. It was meant to echo forever.